by and large, on the majority of the left, no, we do not say that masculinity is inherently problematic. However, there is a vocal minority on the left that seems to have lost the plot on what the conversation about toxic masculinity is supposed to be. So, I did some videos recently on how the left does not do a good enough job at speaking to disenfranchised men who care about the idea of masculinity, because when we try to do the tactic of telling them that masculinity is not important or anything like that, it doesn't work out very well, and they tend to go find spaces that are willing to accept this thing that is so important to them. It's probably important that we take a look at why Republicans can't stop talking about masculinity, aside from the fact that it fucking works for them. But let's first get into the comment section, or not the comment section, the fan art section, which is also a comment section, and then we'll get into that bit of a conversation. This first one is from Adrian Lentil. This is Suris as a pinup girl. I hope you like it. That is fantastic. I also love the shading that has the little, like, comic dots. I love that. I also like the just ginormic hammer. The next one we have here is from Easter May, a cartoony slime Suris with them big old cartoony eyes. I like this. This is adorable. Also, I like how this piece skirts the line between slimy and fluffy in places where you can't really tell which one it is, which is perfect for a slime cat girl. It is absolutely perfect. As always, everybody, thank you all for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future video, then make sure to drop it into the fan art section of the Discord, like people do when they drop fucking crack ships. Fucking jackasses. Anyway, as always, everybody, hit the like button if you haven't already, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's go ahead and get right into Republican lawmakers and hopefuls seem particularly interested in the idea of masculinity lately. In a TV interview earlier this month, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley claimed the left was telling men their masculinity is inherently problematic. He also told interviewer Mike Allen he would make masculinity a signature political issue. Let's talk about that real quick. So, by and large, on the majority of the left, no, we do not say that masculinity is inherently problematic. However, there is a vocal minority on the left that seems to have lost the plot on what the conversation about toxic masculinity is supposed to be. The conversation with toxic masculinity is supposed to be that there are traits that we commonly associate as masculine that need to be weeded out of the gender conversation so that people who would like to be masculine and be perceived as masculine can be their authentic selves without those toxic traits weighing them down. Things like guys not being able to cry. Things like guys not being able to be gay because that's seen as not masculine for a lot of people. These are things that are considered toxic masculinity, and they are aspects of masculinity that should be weeded out of the conversation as best we can. The problem is there are people who have communicated so poorly, even if their intentions were good, something that sounds a lot like masculinity is inherently problematic, and this has certainly not been helped by people who retweet things like hashtag kill all men and hashtag all men are trash and all this other fun shit. And yeah, gay men can be more masculine than straight men. Because there's literally twice the amount of dude there. As a result, the right wing tends to grapple onto this idea of masculinity because people who care about masculinity, but they find themselves on the toxic ends of TikTok and YouTube and social media in general, they'll find the people who are saying things like men are useless or men are inherently problematic. And a conversation can be had about the ways in which we need to be fixing that, but that conversation is a whole lot harder to have when you are ostracizing would-be allies. We'll get into that in a different episode. But let's go ahead and continue. Holly's comment sounds similar to those of Representative Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, who went viral last month in a video calling on mothers to raise their sons to be monsters, which, of course, we covered that concept on the video we did about Jordan Peterson. Said all young men. Today's culture, Cawthorn said, is trying to demasculate all young men because they don't want people who are going to stand up. I am avoiding making a very ableist joke. I am avoiding it very hard because I'm a better person than that. More recently, Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance sounded similar themes in a series of tweets in which he defended Kyle Rittenhouse, the 18-year-old who was acquitted on Friday of all charges in his shootings of 3 men in the aftermath of the demonstrations in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Vance tweeted that the final trial filled him with indescribable rage. We leave our boys without fathers. Do you know why people grow up fatherless? Hold on, let's go ahead and stop that right now. Let's go ahead and stop that one right now. You want to know why people grow up fatherless? Capitalism. I'm dead serious. Guys who feel like the only way that they can provide for their family is hopping into the military and thus not being present for the growing of their kids. Guys who find themselves turning into lives of crime because they can't provide for their families they end up turning to those lives of crime because they are in a position financially where that feels like the only option that they have. Both of those things are inherently from capitalism. Now, the right's goal is to try to shame men into staying in potentially toxic relationships with people in order to better provide for the kids. That is a lot of times they frown on things like divorce and shit like that for that reason. People grow up fatherless when conditions force the fathers to be absent. The conditions can be a toxic relationship. The conditions can be a job that makes them leave for long periods of time. The conditions can be being in jail. The conditions can be endless. We can certainly do things to help those conditions, but we don't do a fucking good job of that. But let's continue. Vance tweeted that the trial filled him with rage, and when human nature tells them to go and defend what no one else is defending, we bring the full weight of the state and global monopolists against them. Global monopolists. That's another way of saying capitalists, but it's also a way of saying Jewish capitalists. I don't like the term globalists. I really don't. According to historian Kristen Kobes-Demez, this way of talking about masculinity has its roots in conservative evangelical spaces, but it's going mainstream. Demez wrote a book last year called Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, about how the model of masculinity in evangelicism went from emulating the qualities of Jesus to emulating those of the actor John Wayne, and how that has shaped culture and politics ever since. Haley, Vance, and Cawthorn all have deep ties to evangelical Christianity and frequently reference the importance of faith in their lives, and especially for Cawthorn and Haley, in their political philosophies. I spoke with Demez about the history of masculinity as an idea in Republican politics and why it's suddenly so popular. This conversation has been edited and then condensed. Aether88, thank you for redeeming your points for an Ada, you fucking degen. Phospholite. Thank you for the follow. It's honestly not fond of John Wayne. You know, the idea that, like, hey, the best way to raise a kid is to toss them directly into the lake and force them to swim. It's not seen as abusive somehow. The idea that everybody needs to fend for themselves and learn how to be the worst version of themselves and then somehow try to control that after cultivating it, that's what they're talking about. Whereas Jesus is portrayed more as somebody who does not want to fight and would rather heal people and literally gave away free health care. But, you know. Yes, the Hihachi way of parenting. Yes, throw him in a volcano. Katie Fawcett, when you heard these comments from Holly and Vance recently, given your background and what you study, what did you hear? Kristen Demez says, I'll start with Haley. Within conservative evangelical spaces, first of all, there is the idea that masculinity is a God-given thing. When Haley is talking about an attack on men and saying that the left is attacking manhood and that they hate this country and don't believe in gender, all that sounds very familiar. In white evangelicism, this has been a refrain for decades now. In evangelical spaces, Christian manhood has been equated, particularly in conservative circles, with a kind of rugged, militant quality. Since the 1960s, conservative evangelicals have elevated more militant ideals of masculinity. One is that they are both the provider and the protector, and they have argued that God created man specifically to fulfill these roles. He's filled men with this testosterone to give them strength, and that testosterone makes them aggressive, and they need to channel that aggression for good. That is their God-given duty as men. And so when I heard Holly talk about courage and independence and assertiveness, that is very similar to how masculinity is discussed in evangelical spaces. Although often, rather than assertiveness, they substitute aggressiveness. It's the difference between me going, hey, I did not appreciate the thing you did, I would like it to stop, and if you don't stop that right now, we're gonna have a problem. And if we've got a problem, you've got a problem. They did very different conversation. This kind of reactionary masculinity emerges in the 1960s and 70s in conservative evangelical spaces, more broadly also in American conservatism. The context here is important. Coming out of the post-war era, there was the baby boom, and traditional family values were all the rage, at least among the white middle class. Then you have the disruptive movements in the 1960s. You have the civil rights movement, which is particularly disruptive in the American South to the status quo. And you have the early feminist wave and second wave feminism in the 1960s, full swing in the 70s, and, very importantly, the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. All of these things are seen to destabilize social order, and conservatives are particularly concerned. In all three of these cases, it's the assertion of white patriarchal authority or power that can restore order. They believed feminism was threatening to emasculate American men, which was leaving the nation weak and unable to defend itself against communism. The anti-war movement, all those hippies and men with long hair, make love, not war, it was leaving the nation imperiled. The civil rights movement as well was seen as a threat. In the American South, particularly white families, the integration of schools was seen as a threat to their children. Against that backdrop, this kind of restoration of a rugged American manhood becomes not just popular, but politicized in a very partisan way. I think it's very true. You have a group of people that feel like they are being ostracized because some of the loudest voices in the room threaten their idea of what a guy is, when the loudest voices in the room are not the men who are out there being the big old swole lumberjacks, but the ones who are saying don't get into fights and are skinny and smoking pot. I can understand why that would be seen as threatening, because I used to be evangelical, so I see this and I can see why that'd be seen as a threat. It's very hard to communicate to somebody that these people are not a threat, because the things that they're saying basically go against your very way of life. If you grew up feeling like you needed to join the military not only to serve your country, but also to earn enough to protect your family, a group of people coming out and being very anti-military is a strike against your identity. That's what it feels like for those people. It's not attacking an idea anymore, it's attacking a part of themselves. Darth Stacks, thank you for the 10 bits for the facepalm. Let's continue. Fawcett says, why is this happening now? Is this language around masculinity becoming more useful in political messaging? Demez says, I think it is becoming more useful in the wake of the Trump years. Because, of course, it was around before. There's a lot of history, particularly of Republicans unfavorably comparing Democratic men and masculinity against stronger, more rugged American manhood. It's kind of had a resurgence during the Obama presidency. It was very popular for Republicans to impugn his masculinity and to question his manhood and his strength. Both men and women did this. Sarah Palin went after him in this respect. It certainly isn't something entirely new. But I think that Trump definitely intensified it, because when you look back to the 2016 Republican primary, Trump appeared on the stage and nobody really knew what to do with him. But he was able to play into this idea of rugged masculinity, this warrior masculinity, more effectively than any of the other candidates. Most Democrats thought it was laughable, but he was reckless, he was uncivil, he was crass. He was not going to be cowed by political correctness. He was a bully on a debate stage against other Republicans, and it worked for him. It made him look strong. Well, to Republicans. It made his opponents look weak. Again, to Republicans. And so you saw them trying to gain the upper hand and try to play that game, but none of them could play it as well as he could because he was completely unrestrained. And I think that's because I think that because that works so well, it seems to me that's the playbook. Certainly anybody who wants to take up Trump's mantle will do that. And then you have J.D. Vance's comments about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I think one of the things that's important to note is that the rugged masculinity And this conservative vision of American manhood historically have been closely linked to Christian nationalism. The idea that we need a strong man who can step up and defend America. And in terms of Christian nationalism, defend Christian America. When I read Hawley's speech from the National Conservative Conference in Orlando, on the one hand, he's praising this group of African-American men who stepped up and brought order to a high school in Louisiana after reports of fighting on campus. On the other hand, he's also linking the left's attack on manhood with their ideas of systemic racism and structural oppression. All of those ideas he sees as a threat to America and a threat to, as he calls it, our shared culture, which would really resonate particularly well with his conservative white base. When we look at Vance, he uses some coded language to talk about the lawless thugs. And for those who don't know, the term lawless thug is basically a term in reference to black people. That's what it is. That's what they mean when they say it. Fawcett says, I saw a Madison Cawthorn speech from a recent event make the rounds on social media a few weeks ago, and that seems to fit the pattern. Dumas says, yes, in that speech, he called on mothers to raise their young men to be monsters. Again, this is something we talked about in the Jordan Peterson video. It's so similar to Hawley's message. He was arguing that culture was trying to demasculate our young men, and it, presumably the left, is doing that because it didn't want young men to stand up to it. This resonates with what Hawley was saying too. He accused the left of sort of trying to make men more tolerant and compliant. It's really important to situate this call for rugged militant masculinity within a political context, which is the fight against the left. Both Hawley and Cawthorn have participated in calls to stop the steal, and Cawthorn actually gave one of the addresses on January 6th, just before the Capitol insurrection. He went on record talking about how bloodshed will be inevitable if our elections continue to be rigged. So it's a call to action for young men to have the backbone, as he puts it in that speech, to stand up and fight back to defend our liberty at all costs. He even goes on to say, there's nothing I would dread more than picking up arms against a fellow American. But essentially, that's where we're headed, is what he tries to say. There was a Public Religion Research Institute American Values survey that came out recently. In that survey, we see that 60% of white evangelicals believe the election was stolen. Of those, 39% believe that violence might be necessary to save the country. So that's what we're talking about here. What is also relevant is that both Cawthorn and Hawley appear to be drawing on the work of Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist and YouTube personality. I think that monster quote from Cawthorn is drawing on Peterson in particular. Peterson is sending the same message to young men that they need to be responsible, they need to be assertive, and they need to be aggressive. As he puts it, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous, and men need to be monsters. That's his word. The hero has to be a monster. He needs to be a controlled monster. But you need to have that danger, that capacity for danger, and then you need to learn how to control it. Otherwise, you'll be too weak to stand for the oppressors. This is why I made the video on Jordan Peterson recently, where I made the argument that we need to take that word, that phrase that has become so ubiquitous in the manosphere over the last 2 years. We need to take that idea and reshape it into something positive. We need to take it and reshape it into something that we can use here on the left. Trying to argue that the idea needs to simply be discarded doesn't work, because the people who latch onto that idea tend to latch onto it very hard. And when they latch onto that idea as hard as they do, they'll listen to anybody who's willing to communicate that idea. So what you need to do is you need to instead take that idea of having access to that aggressiveness that Peterson is communicating, and instead of using the language of identity, being a monster and then learning to control it, you instead use the language of utility, saying that we need to have a monster in our pocket. My argument is that everybody should have the ability to defend the people who matter most to them. But you should not make that a part of your identity, because eventually you're going to find yourself without people around you, and then you're going to be an identity-stricken soldier without a cause. But having access to a tool and simply never having to use it, that's fine. For any of us who have a gun, most of us don't want to ever have to use it. Most of us don't ever want to feel like we're in a position where it's necessary. But we certainly want to have the weapon in case it ever does become necessary. That's different than pretending you are the gun, because then everything you look at is just a fucking target. Both Haley and Cawthorn seem to be influenced by Peterson's message. or at least it resonates with them. And Peterson is extremely popular with conservative white men and young disaffected men. That point right there is the reason why I've tried to argue that we need to do better about reaching out to these types of people, because otherwise they fall for Jordan Peterson and then fall down into listening to, well, the MAGA movement. Haley and Cawthorn seem to be tapping into both those streams and bringing them together as a political call to action. The idea that there's a lot of overlap between conservatives and white evangelical men. Fawcett then says, and Vance's comment about Rittenhouse ties into this too. Dumez says, yes, he's saying this was a young man who stepped in when others failed and when the government failed and acted to use violence to assert order, and that absolutely fits within his call to action to defend our liberty at all costs, and like Cawthorn said, it might require bloodshed. This is what happens when you want to create a militia, when you want to create an army, when you want to create a group of people who are willing to hurt others. You create a hero who was willing to hurt others. Say what you will about Kyle Rittenhouse and how he was innocent or how he was not innocent. I don't care about the legality in that conversation. What I care about is the mentality of going to do what he did. Because that's the thing that resonates with people. Not whether or not he won or lost his trial. Him winning or losing his trial wouldn't have mattered. He either becomes a hero or a martyr. Either way, the right wing has him on a pedestal. It doesn't matter which one is true. What matters is how he gets used as a tool. Phosphophopholite, thank you very much for the 3 months of Tier 1 subscription. That is very generous. Thank you. What matters most here always is going to be, when we're talking about ideas, is the utility of the idea. Whether Rittenhouse should or should not have done what he did, Republicans are going to take him and throw him up on a pedestal and say, this is the ideal man. Be like this. Be violent. Be useful. And if necessary, die for our cause. Said Kyle was just trying to defend himself. Again, that's why I pointed out the legality of what he did and whether or not he should have done what he did doesn't matter. What matters is conservatives want people who are willing to get up, take their guns, and go to a protest and be violent. There's plenty of instances of the Proud Boys trying to create scenarios where people will attack them for the things they're doing, so they have an excuse to be violent. Whether or not individual instances of that violence are justified or not largely doesn't matter to people who lead these movements, people who lead movements like the Proud Boys. All they care about is getting the opportunity for violence. Whether or not that opportunity was justified or not, they simply care that they can get to it in whatever way possible. That said, this is where I gotta throw it back to you guys. What do you think? For me, said making an excuse to be violent is just being human trash. Well, going to a protest with a gun, or creating a counter-protest where you do everything in your power to piss off the other side, however you end up doing it, you can create that scenario. We are human beings, we are flawed, we are easy to manipulate. So, this is where I have to say, we're going to throw it back to you. How do you feel knowing that this is the type of person the right wing wants to prop up, and why? Because remember, the idea here is not whether or not he's right or wrong, angel or saint or devil and demon. No, what matters here is that the right wing are going to take that idea and shape it into what they want. Kyle Rittenhouse was either going to be a hero or a martyr, but what he was going to be eventually would always be useful. This is how we lose people. We lose people when they think, oh, I'm fed up with the state of the world. I want to go be like the guy that the conservatives are talking about as being good. I want to go and be like Kyle. That's how people get killed. But conservative politicians, and I would say even argue a handful of pundits, they don't care if you die. They care if you're useful. This is why it's so important for us to be able to appeal to these people just as much as people on the right wing do, because bringing them over to a side that does not want to try to encourage violence, bringing people to a side that does not want people committing suicide, dying for their cause, bringing people over to a place that is safer and more wholesome is important. Because alternatively, they are tools to be wielded by an ever more fascistic right wing in the United States. That said, know what you think. Hit the like button if you haven't already. And as always, everybody, insert into video tagline here.